They pushed her out of the helicopter seconds later. Their own radio said mission complete. The wind tore through the open bay doors of the helicopter, roaring like an angry god above the Hindu Kush. Inside, a woman sat strapped to the side rail, her boots steady against the metal floor. Her gray shirt was soaked with dust and sweat, her vest marked by years of use. The others saw only an aging loadout tech who didn't belong here. "You betrayed us all," the team leader screamed. His voice cracked through the cabin louder than the rotor blades. Veins stood out on his neck, his gloved fingers stabbing inches from her face. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, on the ridges folding endlessly into blue haze. The sun hit her from behind, outlining her calm like steel. "Say something, damn it," he barked. "You gave them our coordinates. You cost 3 men their lives." Her reply was almost a whisper. "If I had, you wouldn't still be breathing." Hem. The words hung in the air, swallowed by the rotor thunder. A few soldiers shifted uneasily in their harnesses. One young crewman, barely 20, glanced from her to the commander and back again. Something in her tone didn't sound like guilt, it sounded like experience. The commander leaned closer. "You think you're clever? You're done, Keene. The brass will bury you for this." She adjusted the strap across her shoulder. Slow. Deliberate. No apology. No anger. The faint click of a clasp locking into place was the only sound she made. "Sir," the pilot called from the cockpit. "There's interference on the comms encrypted frequency. Unknown origin." "Cut it," the commander snapped. "That's her doing." She looked up for the first time. Just one look, sharp, calm, measured. "That signal isn't from me," she said. "It's from below." The words froze him for half a breath. Then he barked to the crew, "Get her out of here." 2 soldiers moved forward, grabbing her by the arms. Her headset cord snapped loose, whipping in the wind. She didn't resist, just tightened her harness buckle and stepped toward the open door. Below, the mountains spun like dark blades. The world smelled of fuel, metal, and cold air. "Last chance to confess," the commander shouted. She gave him a faint smile, the kind that carried more pity than fear. "You're about to hear the truth yourself." And then she was gone, swallowed by the rushing air, her figure shrinking against the pale morning sky. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the relentless beating of the blades. Then, through the radio, clear, impossible, undeniable, came a woman's voice. "Package secured. Mission complete." The commander's face drained of color. The young crewman's headset slipped from his hand. Outside, somewhere beneath the clouds, the woman they had just thrown away was already rewriting the mission. The cabin was silent, except for the rhythmic thunder of the rotors, a hollow drumbeat echoing through the thin air above the mountains. The men sat frozen in their harnesses, faces pale beneath the dull green glow of the instrument panels, their eyes fixed on the open bay door where she had vanished only seconds earlier. The commander's jaw flexed as he stared into the wind, every muscle in his body locked between rage and disbelief, his mind trying to reconcile the voice that had come through their radio with the woman he had just ordered thrown out. He turned toward the pilot, his tone sharp and breaking slightly at the edges, demanding confirmation that the transmission was real, that it wasn't some echo or misfire from their own systems. The pilot, a quiet veteran with 20 years of flight time, shook his head slowly, eyes darting between the blinking console lights that still registered a classified frequency no one on board should have been able to access. The same channel had been locked for over a decade, reserved for operations, so buried that even mentioning their code names required top-level clearance. A faint hiss filled the radio again, followed by a low series of clicks, each one perfectly spaced like a heartbeat. Then came coordinates, precise and steady, transmitted in the same calm voice they all recognized. The navigator caught his breath and muttered that the numbers matched their original target zone, a ridgeline 20 miles east, where no friendly forces were supposed to be. The commander's anger wavered into confusion as he ordered the pilot to circle back toward the coordinates, every instinct screaming that something impossible was unfolding right beneath them. Outside, the mountains were a jagged ocean of shadow and light, the wind shifting the helicopter like a toy caught in a storm. Below, flashes appeared in the distance, tiny bursts of orange against the gray landscape. The gunner pressed his face to the viewport and swore softly, reporting detonations where the enemy compound had been marked on their mission briefing. The commander grabbed the headset from the console, demanding identification from whoever had called in the strike. But the only answer was that same even tone repeating, "Mission complete, extraction underway." One of the younger soldiers whispered, almost to himself, that maybe she hadn't fallen at all, that maybe she had jumped. The thought spread through the cabin like an infection no one wanted to acknowledge, each man replaying the last moment she had looked at them, the calm, measured gaze, the faint smile, the words that had sounded more like prophecy than defiance. The commander tried to suppress the tremor in his voice as he barked for silence, but it was too late. Doubt had already taken root in all of them. Minutes passed. Then the radar pinged an unidentified object moving parallel to their flight path, low and fast, too small to be another aircraft. The pilot leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the blip flickering across the screen, unable to explain how something without a transponder could keep up with a Black Hawk at altitude. Through the side window, a faint reflection glinted off the mountain face, a parachute, collapsing into the shadows, trailing a figure that disappeared into the valley floor. The commander's stomach turned cold. He ordered a visual sweep, but visibility was fading in the dust and light. A static burst cut through the comms, followed by a digital tone that none of them recognized. The crewman monitoring the encryption board blinked in confusion as a string of symbols appeared, old mission markers from an operation decommissioned years ago, the header reading Sable 7 divided by active link. The realization struck him like a blow. That call sign hadn't been used since the covert Ghost Recon Division was dissolved after the Syrian extraction incident. The commander had read the reports himself. Lieutenant Mara Keene, presumed KIA after a failed hostage rescue that left an entire team missing. But the voice they had heard, the precision of the code, and the coordinates of the explosion all pointed to one conclusion: she had never died. He felt the weight of his own accusation crash down on him. The betrayal he had shouted in her face was now his to carry. The humiliation sealing around him like armor turned to ice. He removed his headset, staring at the floor, trying to slow his breathing as the truth sank in. Around him, the others avoided his eyes, pretending to busy themselves with gear checks and navigation updates. But their silence carried the same message. They had all judged her, and they had all been wrong. As they descended toward the ridgeline, smoke curled upward through the thin mountain air, a black ribbon against the fading Sunday. The pilot reported secondary explosions, secondary heat signatures, no enemy survivors detected. The commander leaned out of the bay door, the wind tearing at his uniform, and caught sight of a flare burning steady on a rocky plateau below. Its color wasn't the enemy's crimson, but a pale, icy blue reserved for high-clearance extraction teams. He didn't say a word. Somewhere in the chaos of guilt and disbelief, something like respect crept into his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. He realized she had never once raised her voice, never once defended herself, because she didn't need to. The truth had been waiting in the air, in the code, in the frequency that now echoed through every comm on the aircraft. As they banked away from the valley, the final transmission came through, calm, clear, impossible to ignore. Alpha 9, return to base. Mission confirmed. Sable 7 off-grid. No one spoke after that. The mountains swallowed their silence as the helicopter turned west, carrying the sound of regret across the endless sky. By the time the helicopter reached base, the sun had begun to bleed out across the horizon, turning the tarmac into a sheet of dull gold. The engines wound down with a metallic groan that seemed to echo their own unease, the kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has been done. Soldiers stepped out in slow, mechanical movements, their boots striking the concrete in rhythm with the guilt they carried. The commander walked last, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of an order that now felt like a crime carved into his chest. They were met by security, before their rotors had even stopped turning. A convoy of armored vehicles rolled across the landing field, dust trailing behind them like ghosts. The men in black uniforms wore no insignia, no names, only mirrored visors that reflected the dying Sunday. Without a word, they surrounded the team and directed them toward a debrief tent set apart from the rest of the compound. Inside, the air smelled of canvas and fuel, and the light flickered with every gust of wind. A colonel from intelligence waited for them, expression unreadable behind thin-framed glasses. He didn't ask questions at first, only played back the audio log from their mission recorder. The room filled again with the voice they had tried not to remember, the calm female tone saying, "Package secured. Mission complete." It was clearer now, isolated and amplified, stripped of interference, undeniable in its identity. The colonel let the words hang before speaking. That voice belongs to Lieutenant Mara Keene. Classified clearance Sable 7. Presumed Kia, Operation Obsidian Hand, Syria, 2012. The commander felt every eye in the room turn toward him. His throat was dry, his palms slick beneath the table, his mind grasping for a defense that didn't sound like cowardice. "Sir," he began, voice low, "she was under suspicion for leaking coordinates. We had evidence she compromised." But the colonel raised a hand, cutting him off with a single sharp gesture. "Evidence fabricated by your own unit's intelligence officer, who has been in detention since 0600 this morning." The room went still. One of the younger soldiers looked sick. The commander opened his mouth again, but no words came. The colonel's tone softened, though it carried the weight of something final. "Lieutenant Keene was not the traitor. She was the countermeasure. The mission you thought you were executing was a loyalty trap designed to identify internal leaks." End quote. The truth unfolded like a slow detonation inside his head. Every order he had barked, every accusation he had thrown, every ounce of hatred in his voice had been recorded, measured, and catalogued. They hadn't just betrayed a soldier, they had provided data on how far trust could collapse under pressure. He wanted to speak, to explain that he had followed protocol, but the words felt hollow, brittle as dust. A low hum interrupted the silence. The colonel turned toward the monitor on his desk, where a live feed flickered to life. The image was grainy, taken from a drone's night vision camera sweeping over a mountain ridge. Amid the shifting gray, a figure moved small, steady, deliberate. The colonel zoomed in until her face came into focus. It was Keene. She was alive, standing beside the wreckage of what looked like a downed enemy transport, her silhouette framed by the burning debris. She glanced once toward the camera, as if aware she was being watched, and then raised her hand in a brief salute before walking out of frame. No one breathed. The commander felt the sound leave his body in a single broken exhale, part disbelief, part awe. The colonel's voice was softer now, almost respectful. "She extracted 2 hostages and neutralized the target alone. No support, no backup. She's off-grid again." He turned to the commander, his eyes unreadable. "You'll submit your report and await reassignment." Outside, the air had cooled, carrying the sharp scent of oil and mountain wind. The commander stepped into the open yard, the weight of the conversation pressing down like armor he could no longer remove. The men from his team stood scattered near the helicopter, heads low, unsure whether to speak or stand at attention. No one met his gaze. He looked up at the sky, where the last of the daylight faded into blue-black, and for the first time in years, he felt small. Far beyond the base perimeter, under the same darkening sky, Mara Keene moved through the wreckage with practiced efficiency. Her hands, steady despite the tremor in her breathing, worked through the debris, collecting what she needed and destroying what she didn't. Her parachute lay torn and half-buried in gravel, the fabric fluttering in the mountain wind. She pressed a button on her wrist console, sending a coded ping across a secure satellite band that no one on the base could read. Somewhere far away, another signal blinked in acknowledgement. Her eyes were hard, but not cruel. The mission had confirmed what command needed to know, that corruption had reached their own chain of trust. Still, the memory of that moment in the helicopter lingered like a scar under her ribs. The shouting, the hatred, the disbelief in their eyes. She had known they wouldn't believe her, had accepted that silence was her only weapon. But when the commander's finger had jabbed toward her face, something colder than anger had taken hold, a certainty that she no longer belonged to any uniform or flag. She walked until the wreckage disappeared behind her, the night wrapping around her like a cloak. Somewhere to the east, the extraction beacon blinked faintly, a blue pulse among the rocks. She didn't rush. She never did. Every step was deliberate, steady, measured the pace of someone who had walked through betrayal before and come out breathing. The radio in her ear crackled once more, faint and distant, carrying the voice of the colonel she knew was watching. "Sable 7, confirm status." She paused, her gaze on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to form above the jagged peaks. "Mission complete," she said quietly, returning to shadow. The transmission ended. The mountain wind carried her words away, scattering them into the cold air where no one could twist or doubt them again. Behind her, the battlefield still smoldered, lighting the valley with a dim orange glow. Ahead of her stretched silence, the kind that belonged only to those who had earned it through pain and purpose. At the base, the commander stood alone beside the empty helicopter, the faint echo of her voice replaying in his memory. He knew he would hear it for the rest of his life, not as condemnation, but as proof that courage could outlive shame. He looked to the mountains, whispered something that only the wind could keep, and for the first time saluted the darkness. 2 weeks later, dawn crept over the desert like a slow-moving tide, washing the dunes in pale gold and shadow. At forward operating base Rainer, the air was still thick with the smell of fuel and dust, the kind of silence that comes before a storm that no one can see but everyone feels. Helicopters sat idle on the tarmac, their blades glinting faintly in the early light, their crews waiting for orders that hadn't come. The commander, no longer wearing the insignia that had once defined him, stood near the hangar, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, watching the horizon where the sky met the sand. He had been transferred back into temporary command pending inquiry, but the word temporary felt like exile written in invisible ink. Each day began the same. Debriefings, silence, the occasional sidelong glance from subordinates who knew just enough to judge but not enough to understand. The official statement had been sanitized into a few sterile lines about mission discrepancies and communication anomalies. But the truth, the living, breathing truth, was still out there somewhere, walking through the world under a different name. That morning, the base radio crackled with static, then steadied into a faint transmission. It wasn't the usual chatter, not the clipped codes of routine patrol reports, but a voice low, deliberate, unmistakably female. "Ghost team inbound," it said. "Package retrieval complete. Confirm base coordinates." The words froze the air like a blade pressed against the skin of the world. The radio officer looked up, eyes wide, and then turned toward the commander. "Sir, it's her." For a moment he didn't move, unsure whether to breathe or listen harder. The officer repeated the signal, slower this time, as if to prove it wasn't an echo. Then came a tone 3 short, 2 long a code he hadn't heard since the Obsidian Hand operation 12 years ago. The commander felt his pulse thudding behind his ribs. "Patch it through," he said quietly. Across the landing field, one of the perimeter sentries shouted, pointing toward the horizon. A lone helicopter was approaching low and fast, its black silhouette skimming just above the dunes. Dust rose in its wake, forming a rolling wave that blurred its outline until it seemed like a ghost materializing from the air itself. When it landed, the sound thundered through every sheet of metal in the compound. The side door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Mara Keene stepped out first. The wind caught her hair and the hem of her jacket, both streaked with sand and ash. Her face was thinner, sharper, carved by exhaustion and distance, but her eyes were steady clear as the desert sky after rain. She walked with no escort, no weapon drawn, only a small encrypted drive in her gloved hand. The soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing, their movements slowing to silence as they realized who she was. None of them saluted. They simply watched. The commander stepped forward, unsure whether to speak or to kneel. His throat tightened as he saw the insignia on her shoulder, a black hawk embossed over the number 7, half burned but still visible. It wasn't regulation. Not anymore. It was the ghost of a unit that had been erased from the records years ago. "I thought you were gone," he said, his voice carrying more truth than apology. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then handed him the drive. "This has everything," she said. "Every transmission, every order. The leak came from above you, not below." He took it without speaking, feeling the weight of it like a verdict in his hands. "I was wrong," he finally managed. The words came out rough, torn by the dryness of the air. "You were following orders I didn't understand." Her eyes softened slightly, though there was no triumph in them, no hint of revenge. "Understanding isn't a requirement," she said. "Honor is." She turned away, her boots crunching against the sand as she moved toward the hangar, the wind lifting dust around her like a halo of ghosts. Inside the operations tower, screens flickered as the encrypted data began to decrypt itself. Faces appeared, men in suits, high-ranking officers, the architects of false accusations. Every document bore the same codename: Obsidian Hand. The proof was irrefutable. She had been sent to expose them, and she had succeeded at the cost of her name, her record, and nearly her life. By midday, the chain of command had been torn open like a wound. Arrest orders were issued across 3 divisions, and the base was sealed for internal review. But in the chaos of paperwork and flashing red alerts, Mara Keene had already disappeared again. Her helicopter was gone, its flight path unregistered, its transponder silent. Only a single message remained in the system log. Sable 7, mission complete, standing by for redeployment. That evening, as the sun bled into the dunes, the commander stood once more at the edge of the airstrip. The desert stretched out before him, endless and empty, a mirror for every regret he had carried since that morning in the helicopter. He thought of her voice on the radio, calm in the face of betrayal, and how courage could sometimes sound like silence. He reached into his pocket and drew out the tarnished rank pin he had worn on that day. Turning it over in his hand, he remembered the accusation, the anger, the order he could never take back. Then, slowly, he placed the pin on the ground beside the landing light, a small gesture of surrender to the truth that had finally found him. High above, the faint hum of rotor blades drifted across the night sky, distant but unmistakable. He looked up and caught a glimpse of a shadow moving east, no lights, no markings, just a black silhouette gliding toward the horizon. For a moment, he raised his hand in salute, though he knew she couldn't see it. The wind answered for her, a soft current brushing across his face, carrying the scent of jet fuel and sand. When the sound faded, the night settled over the base once more. The radio room lights dimmed, the hum of the generators became a low heartbeat beneath the stars, and the desert swallowed the last trace of the helicopter's echo. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a woman moved through the darkness with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. The commander closed his eyes and let the silence fill him, not as punishment but as peace. The past could not be rewritten, but it could be honored. And in that stillness, with the wind whispering across the dunes, he finally understood the line he had once heard her say in another life. Courage doesn't need witnesses, it just needs truth. He stayed there until the dawn returned, painting the world gold again. The air smelled of dust and redemption, and somewhere far off, a single radio crackled to life, one last message before it went silent forever. Sable 7 out. Night had settled over the desert like a velvet shroud, heavy and endless, swallowing the outlines of the base until only the hum of generators marked the edge of civilization. The last of the storm lights flickered out along the runway, leaving the world tinted in silver and shadow. Inside the operations tower, a lone technician monitored the radar feed, fighting sleep as faint echoes blinked across his screen, small, intermittent, almost imperceptible. He frowned, adjusted the calibration, and froze when one signal pulsed again with perfect precision. 3 short, 2 long. He knew that pattern. Everyone who had survived the incident 2 weeks ago did. It was her. The alert rippled through the compound like a shiver running up the spine of a living thing. Officers poured into the control room, voices low but urgent, arguing whether to scramble a team or hold position. The commander arrived last, his boots still coated in dust, his face older than his years. He didn't say a word. As he stared at the radar, the single moving dot creeping across the screen toward the western perimeter. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. Then the signal stopped. Outside, the desert wind began to howl, scattering loose sand into shimmering clouds that caught the faint light of the stars. The commander stepped out of the tower, drawn by instinct more than reason, his hand resting on the sidearm he no longer had the right to carry. The night smelled of metal, oil, and electricity, the scent of unfinished stories. He walked past the silent hangars until he reached the fence line, where the air seemed to hum with something alive and unseen. A figure stood there, half obscured by the dust, framed by the pale glow of a distant landing beacon. She wore no helmet, no insignia, only the ghost of a uniform, stripped of rank but heavy with memory. Her eyes found his immediately, steady and unreadable, the same eyes that had haunted him since the day she fell from the helicopter. She looked older now, or maybe just more real, no longer the myth, but the consequence of one. Mara, he said quietly, her name carrying more reverence than apology. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether the sound deserved acknowledgement. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay a fatigue that no amount of rest could erase. "I heard your signal," he answered. "I thought you were gone." Her expression didn't change. Gone isn't the same as finished. She stepped closer, the wind whipping at her jacket, revealing the worn patch beneath her shoulder strap, the same Black Hawk insignia, now barely visible under layers of dust and time. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about one mission. It was about what they'd become." He wanted to ask who they were, but he already knew. The council that had buried her, the hierarchy that had built lies into protocol, the shadow network that used loyalty like a weapon. She had spent a decade dismantling it from the inside, and he had been a convenient test of whether the infection still lived within the ranks. "They're burning it down," she continued, her tone almost reflective. "The files I left behind, they weren't just proof. They were a map. Someone higher up started the purge this morning. By dawn, everything that carries the Obsidian Hand signature will be erased." She looked past him toward the sleeping base, its faint lights trembling in the dark. "You'll all get new orders, clean records, a chance to pretend none of it happened." He swallowed hard, the words scraping against guilt that hadn't dulled since that day. "And you? Where will you go?" A small, tired smile crossed her lips, not bitter, just weary. "Where ghosts go," she said, "where they stop being useful." She looked toward the horizon, where a faint glimmer of blue light pulsed low against the mountains. Another signal, another extraction. "You could stay," he offered, surprising even himself with the earnestness in his voice. "Let them see you. Let them know the truth came from you." She shook her head, slow and certain. Truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs someone willing to keep it alive. Her gaze softened as she studied his face, perhaps seeing in it the same exhaustion that mirrored her own. "You did what you were trained to do. The difference is, now you know what that means." And, for a moment, they stood there without words, two remnants of the same broken system, bound by silence more powerful than forgiveness. The wind eased, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Then she reached into her pocket and placed something small and metallic in his hand, a patch. The Black Hawk insignia reborn, edges frayed but intact. "Keep it," she said. "Remind them what they tried to bury." Before he could respond, she turned toward the open desert. The faint blue beacon flickered once, then twice, and a transport aircraft emerged from the horizon, flying low and dark. It made no sound as it descended, only a vibration in the air like distant thunder. The commander watched as she approached it, her silhouette framed by the rising dust, her steps steady and unhurried. When the ramp lowered, she paused for just a moment, glancing back toward the base one last time. The light caught her profile, carving her features into something almost mythic, neither soldier nor ghost, but something in between. She lifted her hand in a brief salute, then disappeared inside the aircraft. The engines rose, the sand stormed, and the plane vanished into the night sky, swallowed by the horizon. The silence that followed was immense, the kind that fills the lungs and breaks the heart at once. The commander looked down at the patch in his palm, its threads rough against his skin, and felt a strange calm settle over him. Back at the tower, the radar blinked once more. The technician who had first spotted her signal stared as a final message scrolled across the console in stark white letters. Sable 7, redeployed. Then the screen went dark, the system resetting itself as though erasing her from existence all over again. The commander turned toward the wind, eyes tracing the place where the plane had vanished. The night around him was vast, endless, yet not empty. Somewhere out there, the mission continued quieter, cleaner, and unseen. And though he would never hear her voice again, he understood now that her silence was not absence. It was endurance, sharpened by purpose, carried forward by every soldier who had once doubted her. He pinned the patch to his chest, its frayed edge catching the light of a single flickering beacon, and whispered to the desert, "Mission complete." The wind took the words and scattered them into the dark, carrying them farther than either of them would ever go. Genquin SC said. The desert dawn arrived quietly, bleeding into the horizon like watercolor spreading across a vast and fragile canvas. At Forward Operating Base Raynor, the world felt suspended between two versions of itself, one still living in the rules of the past, and the other blinking awake to the truth that had burned those rules to ash. The night's chill still clung to the steel of the hangars, and the morning wind moved slow through the flags, their faded cloth whispering stories that no one dared to tell aloud. The commander stood at the edge of the landing field, his uniform stripped of insignia, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. The patch she had given him was still pinned to his chest, the Black Hawk emblem dulled by sand but intact, a quiet rebellion against the machine that had devoured its own protectors. Around him, the base stirred with cautious energy. Soldiers moved like men walking on new ground, uncertain whether to rebuild or wait for orders from ghosts. News of the purge had spread like a shadow over the chain of command. High-ranking officers had been removed in silence, their names struck from rosters, their files encrypted beyond retrieval. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everyone knew something irreversible had changed. Rumors whispered through the ranks that a classified unit had been reactivated under a new name, that operations once buried under black ink were now being rewritten by invisible hands. Some said she was leading it. Others said she was gone for good. The commander no longer cared which version was true. Every sunrise now felt like an unspoken question. Who among them still believed in honor, and who merely obeyed its shadow? He spent the mornings walking the perimeter, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dust that the wind quickly erased. The sound of distant rotor blades often reached him from beyond the dunes, phantom echoes that made his chest tighten before reason caught up. Sometimes, in the half-light, he almost expected to see her silhouette appear again through the haze, walking toward him with that same measured calm. But the desert only ever gave him silence. On the 7th morning after her departure, a courier drone descended over the base, small and unmarked, its surface matte black and featureless. It dropped a sealed container directly at the commander's feet before banking sharply and vanishing into the rising sunday. The object was cold to the touch, its weight disproportionate to its size. He brought it into the command tent, the officers gathering around him like men standing before a relic. Inside was a single item, a data drive, identical to the one she had handed him weeks before, except this one bore a different seal, an unbroken circle engraved with the number 7. Attached to it was a handwritten note, just one sentence in neat block letters. Obsidian has fallen. Stand down with honor. He stared at it for a long time, the words both an ending and an order. The air in the tent felt heavier, as if history itself had exhaled. Without speaking, he connected the drive to the terminal. The monitor flared to life, with a sequence of images, documents, recordings, field footage, all bearing evidence of the corruption that had poisoned the upper command. Then, at the very end, a single still frame appeared. The silhouette of a woman standing on a ridge, wind tearing at her coat, her back to the camera. Beneath it, a final message scrolled across the screen. Sable 7 confirmed, exfiltrated. Ghost Recon Division reinstated. No one said a word. One of the younger officers crossed himself without realizing it. The commander closed his eyes, the weight in his chest loosening for the first time in months. Whatever she had set in motion was complete. The truth had reached the light, and the machine that had consumed her had finally begun to crumble under its own deception. He walked out into the open air again, blinking against the brightness. The wind carried a faint warmth now, the kind that hinted at coming change rather than lingering cold. The desert stretched out before him, vast and indifferent, but no longer empty. Somewhere beyond the ridges, he imagined her moving still, a figure written into the geography of silence. He wondered if she ever looked back, or if looking back was a luxury reserved for those who hadn't been turned into symbols. At dusk, the base gathered for an unmarked ceremony. No flags, no anthems, no speeches. Just a single flare shot into the sky, its orange trail burning against the twilight before fading into smoke. It was the kind of gesture soldiers made when words would only cheapen what had been done. The commander watched until the light disappeared, his hand resting over the patch on his chest. When night came, he stood alone at the edge of the airstrip. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, scattered like shrapnel across a dark canvas. In the distance, something glimmered a faint, pulsing blue light, low against the horizon. It blinked 3 times, paused, then blinked again. He smiled faintly. The pattern was unmistakable. Somewhere out there, she was still moving, still fighting, still choosing the silence over applause. He raised his hand in salute, though no one was there to see it, and whispered into the wind, "Godspeed, Sable 7." The words drifted away, caught by the same currents that had once carried her out of reach. In that moment, he understood that her legend wasn't meant to be remembered in medals or reports, but in the quiet acts of those who refused to forget. The radio behind him crackled once more, faint but clear, as if the sky itself had decided to answer. A woman's voice, steady, certain, familiar, cut through the static. "Base Rainer, stand down. The mission is over. Keep the sky clean." The transmission ended before anyone could trace it. The commander exhaled, closing his eyes as the sound dissolved into the hum of the desert night. Above him, the stars continued to burn with quiet defiance, each one a reminder that light, once born, never truly disappears. It just travels farther than anyone can follow. And somewhere beyond that horizon, in the dark between worlds, Mara Keene walked on, her footsteps fading into legend, her silence carrying farther than any voice ever could. Weeks passed before the world dared to resume its rhythm. But even then, it was a different kind of quiet one, born from the weight of things left unsaid. The investigation into Obsidian Hand spread beyond the borders of bases and briefings, unraveling networks that had existed longer than most of the soldiers who served under them. Whole divisions were dissolved overnight, command structures rebuilt from the ground up, and for every officer demoted, there was one more file, quietly stamped, classified, closed. The system was cleaning itself, but at a cost no one dared to measure aloud. At forward operating base Rainer, life returned in fragments. The soldiers drilled, refueled, and repaired, their movements automatic, their conversations stripped of arrogance. They had seen something sacred fracture before their eyes, and the pieces left behind didn't fit into the neat order they'd been trained to obey. The commander moved among them like a ghost in daylight, respected, but not feared, his silence becoming a language everyone understood. Every night, he still walked the perimeter, his shadow long against the floodlights, his gaze pulled always toward the horizon where she had vanished. The new protocols arrived without ceremony. Encrypted orders, restructured teams, a quiet reshuffling of personnel that spoke louder than any announcement could. Among the names reassigned to undisclosed operations, one stood out, Operation Seraph, bearing the same encryption signature as Sable Seven's last transmission. It was a signal, not for him, but for anyone paying attention. He read it twice, then folded the document carefully and locked it in his drawer. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. They just needed to be carried forward. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the dunes, the commander stood beside the radar technician who had once tracked her ghost signal. The younger man said softly, "Sir, do you ever think she'll come back?" The commander's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, the sky turning from gold to indigo. "People like her don't come back," he said finally. "They just keep moving until the world catches up." His voice wasn't mournful. It was reverent, as if describing a force of nature rather than a person. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, unusual for the season, fierce and unrelenting. Lightning carved brief veins of light through the dark, and the wind carried fine sand like a second skin across the base. Alarms sounded, equipment was secured, and the men huddled indoors as the desert turned wild. But through the chaos, the commander remained outside beneath the tower's awning, eyes closed, feeling the storm's pulse in the air. There was something familiar in its pattern, its rhythm, its restrained violence. For a moment, he thought he heard it, the faint crackle of a comm frequency buried beneath the thunder. It was faint, almost swallowed by static, but there a coded transmission, repeating in intervals, identical to the one she'd used months before. The technician ran from the control room, shouting over the storm, "Sir, we're receiving an unregistered signal on S-band. It's the same encryption key." The commander didn't hesitate. "Patch it through." The speakers hissed, then steadied into a voice so calm it cut through the storm like light through fog. "Base Rainer, mission continuity confirmed. Coordinates incoming. Prepare evac for civilian sector east of Ridge 12. M." The room fell silent, except for the rain hammering the roof. No one recognized the coordinates, but they all recognized the tone, the measured cadence, the authority hidden inside restraint. It was her. Before anyone could respond, the transmission continued. No time for verification. Execute with trust, not protocol. The commander felt something in his chest shift, a spark of the instinct that had once driven him to command men through fire. He didn't question it. "Deploy a relief unit to Ridge 12, he ordered, his voice sharp again, alive. I don't care what the maps say, move. 2 hours later, when the storm had cleared enough for visibility, the convoy reached the ridge. They found a collapsed village mud huts and broken walls half buried in sand, and 50 civilians trapped beneath debris. The timing was exact. Any later, and the entire hillside would have caved in. As they worked through the night pulling survivors from the wreckage, one of the soldiers found something half buried in the sand, a torn patch, black with a faint silver hawk still visible. He handed it to the commander without a word. By dawn, every survivor had been evacuated. The commander stood on the ridge, the patch clenched in his fist, the wind tugging at his coat. When he returned to base, he reported the event as unverified intelligence resulting in successful extraction, omitting the transmission entirely. The log would never mention her name again. Later, as the base settled into uneasy calm, he sat alone in his quarters, the patch resting beside his mug of untouched coffee. He thought about her words, execute with trust, not protocol. They echoed like a command meant for something larger than missions or wars. Maybe that was her legacy, not the victories, not the secrets, but the reminder that belief could still exist inside broken systems if someone was willing to act without proof. The next morning, a sealed message arrived through secure courier, marked simply, "From Field Ghost, Untraceable." Inside was a short note, handwritten in the same precise script as before. Trust carried forward. Mission still breathing. Don't let the light go quiet. Beneath it lay a small metal tag engraved with coordinates he didn't recognize. He smiled for the first time in months. Folding the note carefully, he placed it inside his jacket pocket next to the patch. Then, without requesting clearance, he walked toward the hangar where a transport chopper idled for maintenance. "Fuel her up," he told the startled mechanic. "Just a routine patrol." Hours later, as the helicopter lifted off, the base shrank below him, swallowed by dunes and distance. The horizon stretched endless and golden, alive with promise. Somewhere ahead, beyond the static of the comms, he imagined another voice waiting steady, patient, guiding. The mission wasn't over. It had only changed form. Far beneath the rising sun, the desert wind carried two trails of sound, one from a machine still fighting gravity, and another from a woman's voice, buried deep in the static, whispering through unseen frequencies. "Sable 7, continuity confirmed. Keep moving." End of. He didn't answer. He simply smiled, eyes fixed on the horizon, and followed the signal into the light. By the time the helicopter crossed the last line of dunes, the desert below had shifted from gold to gray, a vast ocean of shadow rippling beneath the first light of dawn. The commander sat in silence behind the pilot, his headset alive with faint static, the low hum of the rotors matching the rhythm of his pulse. He hadn't told anyone where he was going or why. The coordinates from the metal tag burned in his memory, numbers that felt more like a compass than an order. He followed them without hesitation, trusting the quiet in his chest more than the noise of any command center. The flight stretched into hours. The world below grew harsher and more barren, the mountains now sharp teeth against the horizon. The air thinned, the temperature dropped, and still he pressed forward, drawn by something that felt older than duty. Every few miles, the comms would crackle with a whisper, almost like a heartbeat, 3 short tones, then silence. It was enough to keep him moving, a reminder that he wasn't chasing ghosts, but being led by one. When the signal finally steadied, it guided him toward a plateau hidden between ridges, a place the maps marked as empty but his instincts recognized immediately. The surface was scorched in a perfect circle, as if a fire had once burned there long and deep. He landed near the edge, the helicopter's downdraft sweeping dust into spirals. For a long moment, he stayed seated, staring through the open door at the endless sky, the silence pressing in around him like a physical weight. Then he saw it, a small object half buried in the dirt, glinting faintly under the rising sunday. He stepped down, boots crunching against the rock, and reached for it. It was an old military dog tag, tarnished but legible. The name read, Keene, Mara L., followed by an identification code that no longer existed in any system. Below it, scratched into the metal, were the same words he had once whispered to the wind. Mission complete. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the engraving bite against his skin, and for the first time in months, his chest loosened. She had been here. Maybe not alive in the way the world defined it, but alive in the only way that mattered. The wind rose, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and smoke. From the corner of his eye, he noticed something else, a shape cut into the rock at the plateau's edge, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. It was a hawk, wings spread, etched deep into the stone. Beneath it, a line of text carved by hand read, "Once thrown, still flew." His throat tightened. It wasn't just a message. It was a memorial, unofficial, unreported, unseen by anyone but him. He walked the perimeter slowly, every step tracing the invisible edges of a story that would never be written down. Scattered pieces of equipment lay half-buried in the sand-broken comm units, burned-out casings, fragments of what looked like a transport drone. It wasn't wreckage from a crash. It was deliberate, erased evidence, as if someone had dismantled an entire operation and left only its heartbeat behind. He crouched near one of the scorched panels and brushed the dust away. Underneath, the faint outline of a handprint was burned into the metal, smaller than his, precise, deliberate. For a moment, he pressed his own palm over it, feeling the temperature difference between steel and skin, between memory and reality. The match was perfect. He looked up, and in that instant, something shimmered on the horizon, a flicker of light, maybe reflection, maybe motion. He raised his binoculars, the lenses catching the faintest trace of a figure walking along the ridgeline. The shape was distant, barely more than a silhouette against the morning glare, but he knew the gait, the balance, the rhythm of each step. Calm, steady, silent. His breath caught. He didn't call out. He didn't move. Some truths were meant to remain unanswered, and this was one of them. He watched until the figure disappeared behind the rocks, swallowed by heat and distance, leaving only the whisper of wind where her shadow had been. The comms crackled again, clearer this time, the voice unmistakable though softer than he remembered. "You found it. That means you understand." He froze, eyes scanning the empty horizon, the headset pressed tight against his ear. "This was never about rank or orders," the voice continued. "It was about remembering what they tried to make us forget." His lips parted, but no sound came. The message played once more before dissolving into static, leaving him with the echo of her words and the heavy calm that followed. He lowered the headset slowly, the silence now carrying its own kind of power. As the sun climbed higher, he sat near the carved hawk and opened the small leather notebook he'd carried since the first mission. For the first time, he wrote without fear of classification or consequence. Line after line, he recorded what had happened not as a report but as testimony. He wrote her name, her unit, the truth of the mission, and the lesson that had carved itself into him like a scar. Courage doesn't need witnesses. It just needs truth. When he finished, he placed the notebook beside the dog tag under a small pile of stones, sealing it against the wind. Then he stood, turned toward the sky, and saluted. It wasn't a gesture of grief anymore, but of continuation, one soldier acknowledging another, across time and silence. As he climbed back into the helicopter, the comms flickered one last time, a final whisper threading through the static. "Goodbye, Commander. The rest is yours now." The words lingered long after the sound faded, echoing through the cabin as the engines roared to life. He lifted off slowly, the ground falling away, the hawk carving shrinking beneath him until it became a symbol instead of a place. From above, the desert looked endless again, but he no longer saw emptiness. He saw traces, paths, patterns, evidence of purpose left behind like constellations drawn in dust. As the helicopter climbed into the morning sky, he whispered to no one and everyone at once, "Once thrown, still flew." The horizon opened before him, and the light spread like redemption. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some stories, he realized, were not meant to end. They were meant to keep flying. By the time the commander returned to base, the desert had already begun to change its color again, trading the pale light of morning for the molten bronze of late afternoon. The air was thicker now, heavier with heat, the kind that made everything shimmer, as though the horizon itself were breathing. He landed the helicopter quietly at the far end of the airfield, shutting down the engines before anyone noticed the unfamiliar markings on its hull. The rotors slowed to stillness, and for a long moment, he simply sat there, his hands resting on the controls, the faint vibration of the dying machine echoing through his bones like a pulse he wasn't ready to let go of. When he finally stepped out, the world felt both familiar and distant, as though the base he'd left weeks ago had been rebuilt in his absence. The guards at the checkpoint nodded but didn't ask questions. There was something about the look in his eyes that told them not to. He crossed the open yard, the sunlight striking his uniform until the patch on his chest glinted like a secret he could no longer keep. In the command tent, a single message awaited him on the desk, an envelope marked with the insignia of the Defense Oversight Council. He tore it open, half expecting the cold precision of dismissal papers, but instead found a single page bearing only one line. Your report stands as final truth. The record will reflect the correction. For a man who had spent his life inside hierarchies built on silence, it was the closest thing to an apology he would ever receive. He folded the paper carefully, slid it into his pocket, and looked toward the window, where the desert stretched in endless waves beyond the fence. He wondered if she knew that the truth had finally made it home, or if she had planned it that way all along. The next days unfolded in slow, deliberate rhythm. Logistics resumed, drills restarted, and the soldiers of Raynor began to laugh again in small, uncertain bursts. But even as normalcy crept back into their routines, something invisible had shifted among them. They spoke more softly now, handled orders with a measure of thought that hadn't existed before. The word protocol had lost its sanctity. In its place was something quieter, stronger respect, earned not by rank, but by restraint. The commander spent his evenings in the hangar, helping the mechanics repair the older aircraft. The smell of oil and dust comforted him more than the sterile air of the control room. It was there, one night, that the technician, the same young man who had first heard her signal, walked in, holding a small data drive. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "this came through one of the encrypted channels again. It's not standard frequency." He took it, plugging it into the nearest console. The screen came alive with static, then steadied into an image so brief and low resolution it could have been dismissed as noise. But it wasn't noise. It was her standing at the edge of a cliff, wind in her hair, the horizon aflame behind her. She didn't speak. Instead, she raised her right hand in salute, the same gesture she had given before disappearing into the storm. Then the feed cut to black, leaving only one final phrase blinking across the bottom corner of the display. Continuity confirmed. End line active. He stared at the screen long after it went dark, his reflection faint in the glass, his expression unreadable even to himself. The technician waited for instruction, but none came. Finally, the commander reached forward and ejected the drive, slipping it into the inner pocket of his jacket without a word. "Erase the record," he said quietly. "It was never received." The young man nodded, though his eyes betrayed the awe of someone who knew he had just witnessed the closing of a circle. Later that night, the commander climbed to the top of the communications tower, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind was warm and dry, humming through the metal rails like a song from another lifetime. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, the one he had found on the plateau, and held it up to the fading light. The engraving caught the last rays of the sun, the words "Mission Complete" glowing faintly before the darkness swallowed them again. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the arrogance, the betrayal, the disbelief, the quiet lessons buried beneath humiliation. He had been taught to follow commands without question, but she had shown him what it meant to follow conviction without ego. The difference between obedience and honor was smaller than a heartbeat, but large enough to change the fate of men. As the stars emerged, he felt something shift in the air, a faint vibration, almost like static but softer, warmer. The comms headset hanging from his belt flickered once, a brief pulse of light, then another. He lifted it slowly, pressed it against his ear, and heard a sound that made his breath catch. Her voice, faint and distant, woven into the frequencies of the night. "You carried it well," she said. "That's all it ever asked of you." He closed his eyes, the wind catching the corners of his jacket, his fingers tightening around the dog tag. "I wasn't sure I could," he answered quietly. "Not after what we did." "You didn't do it," she replied. "You lived through it. There's a difference." The line went silent. Then one last whisper came through barely a breath, almost lost in the wind. "Keep the sky clean." Then the headset went dead. He stood there for a long time, the desert cold biting at his hands, the stars shimmering like distant watchlights. Finally, he placed the headset down on the railing, letting the wind take it. It clattered once against the steel, then vanished into the dark below. In the morning, when the first helicopters lifted off, he didn't join them. Instead, he walked out beyond the perimeter, boots sinking into the sand where the wind erased every footprint as soon as it was made. At the crest of the nearest dune, he stopped, looked back at the base, and smiled not with pride, but with peace. The sun rose, spilling light over the desert like forgiveness. The world, for once, felt quiet enough to listen. Somewhere beyond sight, a radio signal drifted through the upper air, faint and fading, carrying a single voice across the distance between past and redemption. Sable 7 mission complete. Continuity transferred. Oh. And though he knew it was only an echo, he saluted it all the same. Because some voices, he understood now, never truly go silent. They just become the wind. The next morning broke clean and windless, a stillness so complete it felt as if the desert itself were holding its breath. From the top of the communications tower, the commander watched the first rays of sunlight roll over the horizon, painting the dunes in slow, deliberate waves of gold. Below him, the base moved like a waking creature, trucks grinding across the sand, mechanics shouting orders, soldiers forming lines for the morning brief. To anyone else, it was just another day. But to him, it was something else entirely, a closing chapter written in silence and light. He descended the steps one by one, his boots echoing faintly against the metal, each sound a measure of time passing without urgency. At the bottom, a courier was waiting with a sealed envelope bearing the official insignia of the Joint Command. The young man saluted, his face expressionless, and handed it over. The commander broke the seal without ceremony, scanning the short message typed in clipped bureaucratic precision. Effective immediately. Reassigned to Strategic Advisory Unit, North Sector. Classification: Civilian Liaison. Status: Honorable Discharge Optional. He folded the paper once, then again, until it was small enough to fit in his palm. It was the end of one life and the quiet permission to begin another. No parade, no medals, no witnesses. Just an acknowledgement, as restrained as the woman who had taught him what acknowledgement really meant. The rest of the morning passed in rhythm, packing his few belongings, signing off on equipment, shaking hands with men who didn't know whether to thank him or apologize. The hangar smelled of fuel and dust, the familiar perfume of a world that never truly stopped moving. His hand brushed against the patch, still pinned to his chest. The Black Hawk now faded to gray, its edges frayed but unbroken. He didn't remove it. He had decided it would leave only when the wind took it. Outside, the transport convoy waited under the hard light of noon. As he climbed into the back of the lead vehicle, he looked once more at the control tower rising above the base, antennas cutting into the sky like scars. Somewhere in that tangle of metal and signal, her voice had once found him through the noise, steady and unyielding. He wondered if she could still hear him now, if the wind that moved between frequencies still carried his breath when he spoke her name. The convoy rolled out slowly, the engines humming in unison, the horizon swallowing them with each passing mile. The commander kept his gaze on the line where sky met earth, that eternal seam where everything began and ended. The desert was vast, indifferent, but alive, the kind of alive that only those who had been broken and remade could recognize. Every ripple of sand seemed to hold memory, every gust of wind a whisper of unfinished stories. Hours later, as they crossed into the northern sector, a storm began to gather far in the distance. It wasn't the violent kind that stripped the ground bare, but the quiet kind that traveled like breath, reshaping everything it touched. The radio in the cab crackled once, then fell silent. The driver glanced at him, uncertain, but the commander only smiled faintly. "Let it be," he said. "Not every silence needs to be filled." When they stopped for fuel at a small outpost, he stepped out to stretch his legs, the dry air cutting cleanly through his lungs. A young soldier at the checkpoint recognized him and hurried forward with a salute. "Sir," he said nervously, "is it true what they say that Ghost Recon's back?" The commander studied the boy for a long moment before answering. "Ghosts never really leave," he said softly. "They just wait for the living to listen." The boy nodded, though he clearly didn't understand. Few ever did. That night, the convoy reached its destination, a forward logistics hub on the edge of the mountains. The stars above were sharp and countless, the sky so clear it looked like glass. The commander found an empty seat near the perimeter fence, his duffel bag at his feet, and sat there until the noise of the camp faded into distance. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the dog tag, its edges worn smooth by time. Under the starlight, the inscription caught his eye again. Mission complete. He thought of her then not as a ghost or a legend, but as a person who had refused to let the world decide what her silence meant. She hadn't fought for medals or memory. She had fought for the simple right to tell the truth, even when no one was left to hear it. That, he realized, was the real mission, the one that never ended. The wind rose gently across the camp, cool and clean, carrying with it a faint sound of frequency so low it could have been imagination. Yet he heard it all the same, threading through the quiet, 3 short tones, 2 long, and then a single word whispered in the language of code and ghosts. Continue. He closed his eyes, letting the sound settle inside him like breath. It wasn't an order. It was a benediction, a passing of the torch from one survivor to another. At dawn, when the camp began to stir, the commander was already gone. His cot was neatly folded, his duffel light, his flight jacket left behind on the chair. Pinned to its sleeve was the black hawk patch, no longer faded but restored, the stitching cleaned, the threads reinforced, as if it had never been touched by time. On the table beneath it lay a single note, written in his clear, deliberate hand. Courage, honor, and compassion don't fade with rank or time. They just find new wings. End.com. By the time the others found the message, his trail had already disappeared beyond the ridge, erased by the morning wind. Some said he went north to join the advisory unit. Others swore they saw a single helicopter heading west, flying low against the sun, its rotors cutting clean through the dawn. No one ever confirmed which was true. But weeks later, when the storms had passed and the desert calmed, a new carving appeared near the plateau where the hawk had once been etched in stone. It was simple, a pair of wings outstretched beneath a single line of text. For those who kept the sky clean. And on nights when the wind was just right, soldiers on patrol swore they could hear it again, the hum of rotor blades, faint but steady, and a woman's voice carried through the static like a prayer that refused to die. Sable 7. Continuity held. Mission complete. The desert, vast and endless, listened in silence, and then exhaled. The world turned gold again. The years that followed blurred together, stitched by long stretches of silence and the steady rhythm of duty reborn under a different name. The desert changed first, then the faces, then the flags. But the wind stayed the same, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and history, as if the earth itself remembered what men were too proud to say aloud. The commander, now older and leaner, spent his days in places where the sky felt close enough to touch, and the noise of command had softened into something quieter, something almost human. He never returned to Raynor Base, though its coordinates lived inside him like a scar beneath the skin. Instead, he moved between outposts, training younger officers, teaching them how to read the air, how to trust what silence was telling them. He spoke rarely of the past, and when he did, his stories began not with battles but with lessons about restraint, about conviction, about what courage looked like when no one was watching. The recruits listened in stillness, unsure whether they were hearing a fable or a confession. It didn't matter. Both were true in their own way. At night, he would walk to the perimeter, boots sinking into the sand that seemed to stretch forever. The stars above him had not changed. They were still cold, bright, and infinite, but they no longer felt distant. He sometimes wondered if she was somewhere out there, still moving from one shadow to another, still keeping the sky clean in her own quiet way. He had learned to stop asking for proof. Some presences didn't need confirmation. They announced themselves in the calm that followed chaos, in the order left behind after storms. One winter evening, as he camped near a remote signal station on the northern ridge, the radio at his side flickered to life. The static was soft at first, then steadied into the faint pulse of a coded frequency, 3 short tones, 2 long. His heart didn't race the way it once would have. Instead, he smiled, slow and knowing. The message was brief, carried on a low channel meant to travel the curvature of the earth. Field clear. Mission remains alive. Adaptation complete. Have her day. He closed his eyes, listening to the way her voice dissolved into the wind. It wasn't nostalgia, it was confirmation that the world still had guardians who chose anonymity over glory. He whispered into the receiver, not expecting an answer. Acknowledged, Sable 7. Continuity confirmed. The words felt less like communication and more like ritual, a prayer for those who worked in silence. When morning came, snow dusted the dunes, rare and fleeting, turning the desert white for the first time in decades. The sight stopped him mid-step, a landscape remade, fragile but pure. For a moment, he could almost imagine her walking beside him, her boots leaving faint impressions in the frost before vanishing in the Sunday. He thought of the phrase carved into the plateau. Once thrown, still flew, and realized that survival was its own kind of flight. The days grew longer, and the new recruits began calling him the Quiet Captain, a name that carried more respect than any rank could offer. He never corrected them. In time, his legend merged with hers, their stories blending until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Some said he had once thrown her from the sky, others said he had followed her there. The truth, he thought, was simpler. They had both learned how to fall and still rise. Years later, when he finally retired to a small cabin near the western ranges, he brought nothing with him but a single box. Inside it were two objects, her dog tag and the hawk patch she had given him. He placed them side by side on the windowsill, where the light could reach them each morning. The wind outside whistled through the canyons, like a voice half remembered, half alive. Sometimes, when the air shifted just right, it almost sounded like a helicopter passing far overhead, its rhythm slow and steady, beating like a heart that refused to stop. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, the radio on his table came to life again. It had been silent for years, the antenna long rusted, yet now it crackled with clarity that felt almost deliberate. He leaned forward, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "To all stations," the voice said. "Code Black retired. Mission concluded. Sky secure." He sat back, the chair creaking beneath him, and for the first time in decades he allowed himself to rest. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the last light of day shimmered like the edge of a wing. He whispered into the fading frequency, "Copy that, Sable 7. Sky secure." As darkness settled, he took the dog tag in his hand, its edges cool against his skin. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of dust and oil and distant rain filling his lungs. Somewhere, far beyond the visible world, he imagined her smiling, not as a ghost, but as a presence finally at peace. The night deepened, and the stars blinked awake one by one, their cold fire mirrored in the metal of the tag resting in his palm. He thought about everything she had taught him, that truth didn't need permission, that courage could exist in silence, and that redemption wasn't about being forgiven, but about understanding what was worth protecting. The wind shifted again, brushing against his face like the echo of a salute. When dawn came, it found him still sitting by the window, eyes closed, posture straight, the dog tag resting lightly against his chest. The patch beside it fluttered once in the breeze before settling flat again, as if honoring him. The radio remained silent, but the air itself felt charged with the hum of continuity of something larger than time, still in motion, still alive. And when the sun finally broke over the ridges, painting the cabin in gold, the light fell directly across the words etched into the metal, glinting once before fading into warmth. Mission complete. In that silence, the world kept its promise. The sky remained clean. The morning broke with a gentleness rare for the desert, the air cool and weightless, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere impossibly far away. Sunlight slipped across the horizon in slow, deliberate ribbons, touching the cabin windows until the room glowed like the inside of an old lantern. The commander sat motionless in his chair, his back straight, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The radio beside him was silent, the dog tag on the sill catching the light as if alive. Outside, the hawks began their morning flight, circling high above the ridge where the air was thin and the world below looked endless. By mid-morning, 2 young soldiers from a nearby outpost arrived at the cabin. They had been sent to deliver new network equipment to the retired liaison, but found no response when they called out from the porch. One of them, the younger of the 2, stepped inside, his boots quiet against the worn wooden floor. The air was cool, clean, and still. The commander sat exactly as the reports described him, calm, dignified, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far away. For a moment, the soldier thought he might be asleep. Then he noticed the faint smile frozen at the corners of his mouth, the kind reserved for those who have finally heard what they were waiting for. They didn't touch anything. Instead, they stood there in silence, the weight of the room pressing down like reverence. On the table near the radio lay a small envelope, its flap unsealed, the paper inside covered in neat, deliberate handwriting. It wasn't a letter or a confession, just a single paragraph, signed without rank or title. When the world forgets our names, it means we did our jobs well. The measure of a mission isn't glory, it's peace. If you're hearing this, it means the sky is still clean. Keep it that way. And the soldiers folded the note carefully and placed it back where they found it. Outside, the wind began to move again, lifting small spirals of dust across the ridge. One of them looked toward the sky. Shading his eyes against the Sunday, a formation of hawks flew high above, their wings flashing silver in the light. He wasn't sure why, but he raised his hand in salute. The other followed suit, and for a long time, they stood there without speaking. Word of the commander's passing spread slowly, carried by coded channels and quiet messengers. No ceremony was ordered, no official statement released, but across the scattered outposts of the northern sector, soldiers paused during their shifts to face the horizon, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had once taught them to trust what couldn't be seen. Some said that at sunset, a single radio transmission echoed across multiple frequencies, a woman's voice, soft and certain, breaking through the static just long enough to speak 5 words. Continuity confirmed, sky secure, always. Then the signal vanished, leaving the air warm and still. Days later, a patrol unit discovered something new carved into the stone plateau overlooking the valley. The engraving was shallow but precise, its lines weathered by wind yet unmistakable. It was the same hawk wings extended in flight, but now beside it were 2 names, equal in size, facing east toward the rising Sunday. Beneath them, a single phrase stretched across the rock in block letters. Once thrown, still flew. Once broken, still guardian. No one claimed responsibility for the carving, though every man who saw it swore that it had been there since before dawn. At night, when the wind swept through the valleys, the soldiers stationed nearby said the sound it made against the stone resembled rotor blades turning far away. Some swore they heard voices in the static, one calm, one firm, both fading into laughter before silence reclaimed the desert. Whether it was memory, imagination, or something beyond either, no one could say. But every morning, just before first light, the hawks returned to circle the ridge. Their flight pattern never changed, their wings cutting perfect arcs through the air, tracing the outline of something eternal and unseen. And each time they passed overhead, the young soldiers at the nearby post would pause their work, look up, and whisper the same words that had once closed every mission. Sable 7, mission complete. The wind carried the phrase east, toward the rising sun, scattering it across the desert that had witnessed everything yet remembered in silence. And in that quiet, between light and shadow, the world seemed to hold steady for one heartbeat longer, as if honoring not just 2 soldiers, but every unseen guardian who had ever chosen duty over recognition and truth over command. The sky remained clean.